Good. Excellent. Thanks for coming. My name is Brent Patterson. I am not a computer scientist in any way, and one of the things that make me a little bit nervous about showing you this presentation is I know a lot of tech people will wince at what I'm about to do. I'm doing this basic, using a graphical debugger to inject a process into Chrome, and so it's not the most secure thing to do, and Google doesn't like it. But I made a music video a few years ago, and so I do weird experiments all the time. If you've never seen my website, I do like volumetric tests. I do lots of stuff. I've been using Blender for about 16, 17 years and teaching it at the university level as well. And so I currently am doing lots of projects where I use procedural volumetrics to create basically nebulas and things like that for planetariums. But I also just do weird stuff because I'm an artist. But this kind of stuff is some of my favorite kind of stuff to do. But a number of years ago, I was doing experiments with photogrammetry, and not iPhone photogrammetry and LiDARs and things like that, but rather using some software called Meshroom. It's from a software consortium in Germany called Alice Vision. And so all of the links and everything are laid out here in the handout for all the software I'm using. But Alice Vision, they have a bunch of free and open source tools for photogrammetry. And so one of the softwares they have is called Meshroom. And what Meshroom does is it just takes any number of photos and tries to stitch them together into geometry. And the process takes a little while. So I ran a process last night to basically show how.
Yeah, I was actually saying.
I just accidentally opened up another version of it. But at the core, what Meshroom does is you just dump a photo set into it. So I've got a bunch of photos here of a garden from behind a pub. Specifically, this was a photo set that was sent to me by a film studio in London. They reached out to me 2 years ago to work on a music video based on the test and everything that I had done. They at first just asked me how I did it, then asked if I wanted to be a consultant, then asked if I would produce the video. So it sort of escalated. And because it was in the middle of the pandemic, I was working from home anyway. It was in between semesters. I said, let's go for it. And so I spent 2 months working remotely with a film studio in London, producing a music video. And so what they were doing, we did a whole bunch of tests at first, and then they started sending me photo set after photo set. And what Meshroom does is it just looks at all the photos and then postulates where the camera was in the photos, and then creates this point cloud. And it looks a little complicated, but this is really just the default settings of Meshroom. You just take a folder of photos, like I have, let's see, here's that photo set. Like this photo set right here is just a whole bunch of iPhone photos that they sent me from the UK, and this works for anything. And then you just chew on it for a little while with Meshroom. You just load all the photos in here, and you don't have to change any of the settings, but you can tweak them for all sorts of different settings. Each of these little nodes does different things. It first just grabs the data, then it processes all the photos, looking for feature relationships and matching, and then it builds a structure from all of that. Yeah.
Does it have to have like the cameras like in a structured location or like spacing and all that, or is it?
It only looks at the images. It doesn't look at any image.
So the camera placement doesn't really matter.
It doesn't look at any of the metadata in the photo. It only looks at the images. So it doesn't just have to be photos. You can export an image sequence, and then you can use the image, or you can take a video file.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. Yeah, I understand.
You can take a video file and do the same thing. And so it also, instead of just photogrammetry, it can also generate camera tracking. So if you're doing any type of visual effects, which is sort of my specialty, it's really good for that. It's a completely free program, and it works really well. But it doesn't work perfectly, and that's the thing, because photogrammetry isn't exactly perfect. What it works really great for are stationary objects, statues, objects and things like that. So if you're making a video game, is fantastic for assets. So if you wanted to just take a picture of a car, you just take 50 pictures of a car going all around it, and it makes a pretty good mesh of that. But if it's a person, people move, and so it doesn't work very well. But I like that because I'm an artist, and so
it's like a distortion.
It creates all sorts of weird distortions that also mimic reality. Yeah.
So does this software have some sort of like depth perception mechanism, or do you have to get photos from all angles?
You have to get photos from all angles, and otherwise it'll just generate data from what it sees. So if you don't have any of the back would be flat.
It'll just be flat.
It'll try to extrapolate that. It'll coordinate the background with the, and if there is no background, then that sometimes can help. So then, let's see here, texturing, and then the meshing, but if I click on one of these, it should texture it. And Meshroom only works on a machine with an NVIDIA card, so that's kind of a downfall. So if you've got just the integrated GPU or just an AMD card, not just, but if you just, it unfortunately only works with NVIDIA. And so
does it have to be like a newer cards, or is it?
Not necessarily. When I did all these projects a while back, I did it all with a 2070, and I did it all in Linux. And so it worked perfectly well with Linux. And I produced a whole music video on Linux. So here is the mesh. And then you can see where it sees all the cameras. And then it's never quite perfect. But it does quite, and depending on the photo, some things will have quite a lot of detail and other things won't. But the process is super simple, and so if you're interested in doing these kind of assets, it works. And so basically you can just take this texturing area right here, and you can open that folder, and inside of that folder, you'll see here is the OBJ that it generated from that node. So each of these nodes can export different types of files. So then you can just take the contents of that OBJ, and then you can import it into Blender. And so has anyone in here ever used Blender? I know you have. I make my students use it. I've been working with Blender at the academic level, like I said, since 2006. And I've been working with a lot of people over the years who are like scared to death of open source software. And as my students know, I'm a big advocate for it because I think I gave a talk at the Blender conference a few years ago called Don't Go Pro. Look it up. It's about how software markets itself in a corrosive way, such that people think that if they know the software, then they're an artist, or at least a professional. And I drew issue with that. But anyway, let's see if we can import that now. The machine's acting really slow, which has got me very nervous. I don't know why it's running so slow. I might have to do a restart, because this is normally a pretty fast machine. It has a 3080 on it, but that tells me something's wrong. And the way it's becoming not responsive, which I did a test before, and it was working fine, but
this is a live demo.
This is always how it is. It's
a live demo. This is gonna
we have to go out of the room and then it'll work fine.
Probably. Let me just do a real quick restart because I don't trust the way this thing's behaving. And I apologize. I can take this opportunity to answer questions though, because I wanted to show you the music video and stuff that I made with this. It's gone on to win some awards and generate a little bit more work. But I'm currently writing a book for a publisher who reached out to me because I'm not busy enough about all the tips and tricks I've come to use over the past 15 and 16 years when teaching Blender. So it's just going to be 100 tips that it's an intermediate level book, and I'm a good writer, but I'm a super slow writer, and so I have this sadistic quality about myself where if I see a deficiency, I put myself in a situation where I have to overcome that deficiency to make myself stronger in it. And one would think after 20 years as being a teacher, I'd be a better speaker in front of people. But I wasn't good at speaking in front of people, so one of my first jobs was working at a radio station. and to overcome that problem. And it didn't help. I was the worst radio DJ. As soon as the mic came on, I couldn't speak, and I was only 16, but I would have to write everything down to know what I was going to say. But I just put myself in bad situations. Were you going to say something?
I have one question.
Yes.
It's working. It seems to work really neat with flat files. How would it deal with something like, say, a photosphere, a stitched 3D full?
I should have brought up the examples of that because I did use 360 recorded video as the test, and it worked.
Okay.
My buddy, we were going to do parts of the music video in the London Tube, and so he took a 360 camera and just ran through the trains.
Yeah.
And it worked. It worked. It didn't work with a whole lot of detail because the 360 camera
that's the
was
problem.
only 1080p.
Okay.
And
what most people don't understand is that 1080p is for the full sphere,
Right.
not just any single frame of a view. I take stitched 3D photos with a 16 megapixel camera, so I get like 5,000 by 2,000
Right.
photospheres. that
So
are
I just
much more
recently
detailed.
ordered a new 360 camera that does 4K video.
Yeah.
And so each section will still only be like 1080 or so.
Right.
But I'm hoping that we'll get better results from that. And so the higher, and one of the other issues is when you're dealing with 4K stills, that if you're on a lower quality GPU,
It'll take a while.
it won't work. It'll just say out of RAM, out of video RAM. So it helps to have a beefier GPU to make this work.
Okay.
And for the music video, since I was on a 2070, and I think the 2070 had 16 gigabytes of RAM, I had to scale down the photos that were taken with a DSLR, and they were like 6,000 pixels. So I'd have to scale down the sequence down to maybe 3,000 pixels.
Got it.
And then the processor could work. But again, you would have less detail in the final processes that came out of that.
Okay.
Let's see if that worked. Notice how I took up the time of the reboot and didn't just keep him quiet.
What camera did you get?
What's that?
What camera did you go with?
I can't remember. It was one of the top rated on B&H. I had a quick ask from an admin. We got some money. Can buy something. What do you want? This.
Yeah.
And
I was looking at the Insta.
It's the 360.
Yeah. Did you have you ever experience with them?
Not too much, no. Most of the photogrammetry work I've just done with Android phones and
But now that they're almost becoming a commercialized device.
So anyway, let's try just opening up Blender here and see if we got a more responsive machine this time. And this machine's been acting a little bit funny ever since the admins did an update to it.
That's the other rule: is never do an update before presentation.
That is some hard truth right there. When I was for 4 years, I did this experiment where I only used Linux, and in that world, updates were always good, at least for me. But since I've switched over to this Windows machine, because I just go back and forth, wow, that res is terrible. Sorry. Updates are much more of a Russian roulette. So let's go here to. And I am just getting over a food poisoning episode this week, so I'm still a little not myself. Don't eat a Bob Evans in West Virginia. That was a mistake. Let's see here. So I'm navigating to. Should be in there. It's not. Let's see here. Oh, you know what? I didn't texture that one, or did I? That's something completely different. Let's go over here to mushroom again. And I did rehearse this. I'm glad they gave me 50 minutes. So like I said, if you right-click and let's come over here. Because this is only the first part of the talk. The other talk was hacking Google Maps. So let's see here. Let's come over and folder. What was that? BSides, mesh room 1. It's in that wonderfully named folder right there. We should. I don't think you can import. By default, you can import OBJs into Blender and export all these different kinds of formats. So it's very format compatible there. Let's go back. So these cache files that it generates get really big. So the more you do of these, it will fill up your hard drive. Most of these cache files can sometimes, if you have 1,000 photos in there, the folder will become 30 gigabytes, sometimes 80. So I normally do this on an external hard drive. After you get the OBJ and the textures, you can delete everything else. But the process itself takes a really long time. And depending on the settings that you have in Meshroom, the geometry can be really huge. So if you're doing this for building assets in a video game, you'll want to retopologize the mesh. And Blender has a lot of tools for doing that. And there's some pretty good plugins these days that automatically do that. But the meshes that Meshroom generates are not appropriate for characters to animate, because they're filled with triangles instead of quads. And if you know anything about video game 3D stuff, triangles are the devil. And so you don't want to do that. So I think it was this one. And so you can see this OBJ is 386 megabytes for this garden. But then you can import it. And this is it. So this is the mesh. If we switch over to shading, it'll load all the textures. It takes a moment. And so there we are. So this is the garden hub. And when we did this, and this mouse is dying because that's what I chose to use today. And so when we did this in the music video, I could add lights, and we added other picnic tables, and then we photographed people individually to fill the space. And so it worked really well, specifically because we were leaning into the gnarled look that this geometry generated. We didn't want it to look perfect. We wanted it to look mingled, because the music video itself was about memory loss and losing people and so forth. So let's come back over to that music video. And I gave my talk at the Blender conference last October with my collaborator about that music video's production. So I'm just going to show a bit of that music video, because it's a long one. And it's a guy named David Bath, and it's an Irish band called For Those I Love. And we spent countless hours color correcting and working on the color, the lighting, and everything, and then the record label said, we want it in black and white. And so that's and I couldn't get the PA system. It's a little thin, yeah. It's not very easy. So we would take all that photogrammetry and put it together in really large scenes, and then I would fly the camera through that geometry and light it as well. Narrow depth of fields and everything to make that work. And then a compositor in the UK would take different shots that we made, make them all look like one continuous scene, because there was actually several renders. And some of this was actually shot. I did some scenes here in Buffalo. I took some of the stairwells in my house and some of the elements that I photographed here. And then, but most of it was photographed in London, and Ireland.
To his heart in the morning stars, terrified. I went quiet and I stood and I started to run from love, because you're told you need to grow cold to grow old. I was sitting in that same field beside
working
the
with the film studio,
the leaves and the grass until
we just did everything over Google Meet and Discord.
This is no dramatic. This is no
video
tales and
conferencing
90s classics.
So
You
it's kind of a
spend
cool
your whole
experience.
life
It
being
was like
brave
working
and you hope
directly
that
with
things
them.
will change.
So
So
3,000
don't
miles
fucking
away.
ask me where
And
I
for
know
really
my
large
age.
files,
It just marks the
that
time
they
and
would send
things
me,
staying the same.
we would
The
just use
songs
these
sound fun and you dance
no,
with your mates and it's
we
grand.
did a project, we ordered our own Dropbox as well. Dropbox account that we shared everything. That worked out really well.
Did they add like the dramatic lighting, like the the shadows and the positives?
No, I did all that in Blender.
Okay.
So I did all that in camera and in Blender. Yeah, Blender can do all of that. And we rendered it not with the cyclic ray tracers. If you know anything about Blender, there's two ray tracers in it. Well, one isn't a ray tracer. There's the EV render engine, which is kind of like a Unity render engine. It's a real-time render engine that's good for just visualizing everything. At first it was a scratch render, but it became very powerful, and so now you can actually render things with it. It doesn't handle caustics and everything quite as well, but this was all rendered with that. And so that way, the frames were usually only, even on a laptop, only about 5 to 10 seconds to render for thread. And so if you have a powerful machine, it would be real. But for building and just doing a playthrough, you can do all that in real time. But the cyclist is a lot slower, but getting increasingly fast. So here's that garden scene that was integrated into it. So we added all the people and added other lighting, and you can't even, so the gnarled look of it and everything is appropriate for what you're trying to do.
I'll hold on a little tighter.
So these people models are made using the
Forever and a day.
Measuring, yeah. So we just photographed them all in the studio and didn't put them into the scene.
And because they're models, you can actually fly through them, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. So and then as the video gets more and more distorted, I added that graffiti to the shot, and having people like moving around larger and smaller to make it more psychotic.
There's a lot of detail in the pixel models. Was there anything added to them after
No. Measuring has tons of settings and can get really overwhelming. And so you can tweak the settings and how much detail it wants to extract from the scene. There's several ways to get different detail out of it. One is to feed in the full res DSLR photos, and it will get a lot of detail that way. But the people move, and if they move in any way, you'll get all this wonderful distortion. Or you can scale down the photos, and you get more of a gnarled effect. Sometimes the figures were too detailed, and I would remesh them a little bit to make them more distorted, to make the characters more consistent. But there are scenes in the rave, the rave right here, where some of we had too many characters to fit in. So we did cheat a little bit, and we did use an iPhone and iPad LiDAR to do some characters really quickly. And so, because when Meshroom processes these photos and these scenes, depending on the photo set, like the alley that we did right here, there's the alley. It was an alleyway. It's after the rave, that's right. This alley had 1,000 photos, and the person just walked down an alley in, they called it a lane in Dublin. And this actually had a lot of detail, more than we wanted. And so we had to dirty it up a little bit. And then I added manually, I just created one light post and duplicated it over and over again, and then put a light inside of each one so that the lights would animate coming on over time. So then I would dirty it up by using some remesh and some displacement on the geometry to make it fit, to make it look like that it was more gnarled with everything else. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
So you use Meshroom only for the objects, right? Like
and the people.
Manual objects and people. And then everything else is just the photo.
I use Meshroom for the sets. I use Meshroom for the people, and Meshroom for any objects that might be in there. Occasionally, we used iPads and iPhones with LiDAR to generate some of the geometry. But generally speaking, that system created more blobby shapes and less garbled shapes. And so, I don't know, that's not real professional geometry, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we used a whole bunch of different tools. And all the rendering was done in Blender, and then a studio in the UK edited all the renders together, and then another studio did the color correcting, which took out all the color. And that was the basic project. Here's a behind the scenes to get a better idea of it. So you can see all the photos that we used for it. my collaborator, who never used Linux or anything before, he used what's it? I think it was just a MacBook Air, so that's why you saw some Mac OS extraction.
So do you modify any of those like images? I know you kind of purposely were going for that like broken up look, so like some of the wall was locked and things like that. But did you modify any of those and like remove those aspects? Was this easy to do after that?
Yeah, after it was in Blender, like the pub here was way too big. So I cut the pub in half, and that's what you just saw in the video. And then I would bring the walls together to make the pub seem smaller. So I could change the geometry, and because we were just embracing the gnarled look, I didn't have to worry about the detail. And because we were lighting it, very dark, that helped too. I could just people only look at what you put the light at, and so they'll just assume that everything else is all put together. And this is true in all filmmaking and all art, that you can direct attention so that all the garbled and messed up stuff, people won't even notice. They only notice what you're asking them to see. And so where the camera is pointing and where the camera is moving will direct attention, and all the other stuff just gets filled in. And selected sort of gestural theory, we'll assume it's all there when it's not. Some things would show up crazy detail, like the back of David's shirt here, we'll see it in a second.
As well as
and so like
the back of the t-shirt there.
Everything showed up on the back of that shirt.
It's like perfect. I think it's because it's the high contrast.
But some things wouldn't show up. And so that randomness was really wonderful.
Yeah, you said that for people it's harder to, capturing all the images because people move. For some instance, did you have to tell them to hold still while you were getting the images, or?
Oh yeah, you had to tell them to hold really still, and while we would move the camera around, and not just 360, but up and down and all around, so we could use it. But when people didn't hold still, their limbs would just go missing. And so the way measuring works is if it can't figure it out, it just won't put it in there. And so DadBod was the company I did that with. And so the whole point of this is ask yourself whenever you're approaching any software is what was it meant to do, but what else can it do? And so embracing the weird artifacts of the software instead of trying to hide them is the fun part, and it actually makes it possible. And that's sort of my motto with a lot of software is what was it meant to do, but what else can it do? If we use it wrong, what interesting results do we get? And so I really enjoy that process. But I was making a video. Let's go to my Vimeo account here, and probably got too much stuff on here, but let's see here. I was working during the pandemic. After I finished that project, I wanted to make, because we can't have a graduation for our students, I wanted to make a video that thanked everyone for everything that they've done. So I tend to make these sort of compendium videos for the students that make people weepy and so forth. But I wanted to have flyovers of campus, and so I needed a way of doing that would work. That I didn't want to go out and do all the measuring stuff yet. And so I came up with this way, after several YouTube videos, of harvesting Google Maps data. So then I could import that into Blender and fly around it. Now, Google Maps data is like the measure stuff. It's very garbled and not very detailed. So I created this stylized way of looking at it. So I just made all the colors off and everything, so that way people wouldn't really worry about why does everything look garbled. It's just stylized look. So instead of hiding it, lean into it, make it more stylized. And that process always works, and people just assume, oh, they meant to do that. So yeah, so I created this video where after every sort of category, we fly around campus. the 3D stuff was rendered in Blender. All this kind of compositing was done in a free and open source video program called KDN Live, and then it was just all exported. But I wanted to show that process, and that process is a bit more complicated, and that's what the flyers that I handed, or the handouts I handed out, talk about. And so there's several bits of software that you need for this to work. One of them is an add-on called Maps, Google Maps Model Importer, and simple Google searches will yield those. So Google Maps.
Is this a process you developed, or is this something that?
This is a process. There's a source at the end of the handout where I got this from. I distilled it to its basic elements to make it more approachable, because the other sources, and there's a few YouTube videos where you can watch, but what I'm always, as a teacher, what I'm always trying to do is, how can I distill this out to make it more accessible to non-technical people so they can become more technical? So I know this is probably the wrong conference to speak this to, because this is very technical people, but I'm used to working with artists and designers, and I'm the digital media professor, so my whole shtick is always, how can I make technical stuff accessible to non-technical people so that they're not afraid of it? And so I do that. That's just, is that what I do? Okay, is that? I sometimes don't do a very good job of it, and because I can feel the oxygen start to leave the room sometimes as I'm giving an in-depth Blender tutorial, and I just feel everybody just wandering off. I see their ghosts leaving their bodies, and I'm so sorry I got too much into it, because I've been doing it for a really long time, but Maps Model Importer assumes that you extracted the data from Google as something called an RDC file. But in order to do that, we have to go through some other steps. We have to actually inject a process into your Google Chrome to make this work. And then you can import it with all the detail and fly over it as such. But the first thing to do is we have to quit Chrome. No iteration of Chrome can be running. And we have to create a new shortcut of Chrome. Let's close this so we're not using up more RAM. And create a new shortcut of Chrome from wherever Chrome is installed. Because sometimes Chrome is installed in your program's x86 file. And as far as I know, this works on Linux, but I haven't tried it on Linux. If you're on a Mac, this won't work. On Windows, this still works, and I tested it yesterday just to make sure, because Google probably will do an update soon. It's been there for a few years, so maybe they won't, where this won't work, but they probably don't want you to do this. And I think there's an employee from Google here, so. But anyway, if we look at the properties for this, we have to inject or change the target. We have to add this flag to the target when we to the shortcut. And so there's two bits of text I put in the handout for doing that.
Yeah, this could have been like a little tiny bit. Like you could have like the technical version, like one.
Right, and so I'm trying to, and I don't know.
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Oh, okay, and this is where I said people might squirm when I do this, because it basically changes the nature of this. So making sure that no other iteration of Chrome is currently running. We'll launch this. And what we do when we launch this is it does this. It makes Chrome all white, but it adds a little dialog box right here with the GPU process ID. And we'll need that number, 76, I can't read, 7464. And you have to do that right after you open RDC. So RDC, does anyone, not RDC, RenderDoc, does anyone use RenderDoc for game development? Okay, good, because I don't need it. But I use it for this process. So RenderDoc is a game graphics debugger. And the developer of this, we're very grateful to, and we should donate money to, but he took the process for doing this, he made it a little bit harder because he saw people were using it for nefarious purposes. Not unlike what I'm doing, but what we want to do is we want to make sure under the tools and settings that one of the settings we turn on, enable process injection. That's turned off by default to prevent what I'm about to do. But sometimes you need it. And so once RenderDoc is open, we want to go to File, Inject into Process. And what we need to do is search for the process ID that Chrome will generate. And so then once RenderDoc is at this position. We can open up chrome.exe, and we see that dialog, and it kind of disappears. So we'll just make sure we get it. Now it's 23488. And so we want to make sure we type in 23488, refresh, sees it right there. We double click it, and then right away we come back over here and we click OK. And now we see that it's ready to capture. And so now RenderDoc is connected to Chrome, my understanding of it. I am not a computer scientist, I am an artist. That's my disclaimer here. And so what I might do, it's never broken my computer, and it's always worked, but it might break your computer. It won't break your computer. So anyway, I'm going to add a delay, because if I hit capture immediately, it'll just capture whatever's in the GPU buffer at this time. And as far as I've tested this on AMD processors as well as NVIDIA processors. I know it works in both. It doesn't work if you're just using the integrated GPU. Okay, so I'm going to add a delay here of 3 seconds. So that way I can add, I can just go here, let's go to Google Maps. Let's go to where we are. Where are we?
Right about, yeah.
About right here.
Yeah.
Canisius College.
It's going to have a garage that's no longer there.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch to the 3D view. Now, if I were to change my view so that I'm looking at it like this, I'm hitting Control-Shift, and I hit capture. It's going to capture the building and everything else out to the horizon. Don't do that, because it goes all the way to the horizon and gets the really low poly stuff. So if instead I look straight down on it, it'll capture in the highest res that's available just what's in the current buffer.
Will it capture the vertical planes that you can't visibly see?
Yeah, because it's all loaded there.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to do. Is just get it into the RAM, the video RAM.
Yeah.
And whatever's currently in the video RAM. But it doesn't just work that way. It only works while it's moving.
It's like the Google, yeah, that's how they got it, yeah.
That's how they capture it. So that's why I put the delay on RenderDoc, okay? I know no one will like this, and so this is like not the most user-friendly experience, but that's the fun of it, really, because I love telling students, and that's why my students like open source, is because we're using stuff wrong. So anyway, that's why I put the 3-second delay there, because if I capture immediately, I can't immediately go over there and move it. But if I put capture delay of 2 or 3 seconds, then I come over here and I just wiggle it, and when it lags, right there, I know it did the capture. So I come back over to RenderDoc, and there it be. Okay? And so then it captured all the textures and everything that went along with it, and then I can right-click and save. And I'll save it as an RTC file. All right? And so the real deal. Put it there, and there I'll just call it science. Save. And so we can come over to Blender. And if you don't know anything about add-ons, we want to make sure, and I put a link to the Maps importer. So Maps Models Importer is installed. It's just an add-on. It's a simple Python script. And it works. But what I found is RenderDoc, the newest version of RenderDoc, isn't working with the newest version of Model Maps Importer. So you just got to play around with that. Version 1.19 of RenderDoc is still compatible with this version of Maps Model Importer. So luckily, all the previous versions are still online.
Yeah. Well, what about Chrome versions? I usually run like Chrome Dev. Anything like the higher Chrome versions change anything?
So far, no. It still works. I'm using the newest version of Chrome here,
Okay.
but I haven't. Whenever I see the update, I just hit update like a fool. So I'm just running the newest version. So once the Maps, once that add-on is installed, 5, 10. Okay, great. We're almost there. Go to File, Import, and then you'll see it down here at the bottom of the import list. And so then we can navigate to that file. The real deal. Here's the RDC. It's 43 megabytes. This is the moment of truth. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we import. And these are large files, so there might be a delay while it's importing. There it goes. It's a good sign, actually. There it is. Cool. And so here is all this view. And so there's the geometry. And if we switch over to shaded view, there's all the textures.
Wow.
And so you can see that's everything that was in that viewport. and it works. Yeah.
Do you know of any way to stitch in like your own photos if you want to like put more detail in certain spots?
You can go into edit mode. Notice it's multiple objects here. You can go into edit mode, and you can clean up that geometry and do whatever you need to. But I would have some experience with 3D and understand how UV mapping and everything works. Because if we go over to the UV editor, you'll see this is what Google Maps generates, this mess of a texture system. And you can rebake all of that into a cleaner texture for a game or something if you wanted to. But of course, you're breaking all sorts of copyright rules because this belongs to Google. This is their data. And
part of it's their data. There's actually, you can go to the USGS site and get all of the microcentimeter LiDAR data for the US. And that's what Google did that with.
Okay, so what I'm saying might be wrong.
It might be wrong depending on where they source their data.
Okay.
So if the textures are probably done with a company like Photometry that does flyovers for them, and that's licensed copyright data. But the actual shape of the buildings and Google is using shapefiles, and some other people are using shapefiles from Microsoft. So depending on how those are identified or listed for sourcing, they may be perfectly legal for you to use publicly. You just have to try to figure out what the original sourcing is.
Cool. So if you know more about, thank you. If you know more about 3D, you can go in here, you can clean it all up. You can join these objects. You could send it all to, if you go to File, Export, you can send it as an STL file to a 3D printer. It wouldn't be a very good 3D print, but you get the idea. Now, more, not that the Canisius Science Hall isn't a world-famous landmark, but more world-famous landmarks have more detail. And so if you wanted to do like the Eiffel Tower, buildings in New York City, they have a lot of detail. But I see everyone's eyes are like, I can do something with this. And so that's where it gets exciting. It's an easy process, it's accessible, and you can go through here. Like if you don't want any of these, this neighborhood over here, this isn't very nice, but you can just delete it. And if you're just trying to go through here, and now remember, each of these are separate objects. You can see how the Google system works with all these tiles. You can merge all of that. So if I hit Control G, it might crash, but it'll merge all of that into one larger object that I can go into edit mode on and then rebake all of that. It won't actually combine that. If you wanted to do some fun things, like change the lighting, you can come over here. Now the lighting that's sort of baked into it is the original textures and shadows and everything of the scene, but you can add volumetrics. You can come over here and let's say, let's change the world. First add a light, just put a light. Let's add a light, and let's put a light right there. And then let's change our world settings to just be all black. Let's get rid of any other lights in the scene. Shouldn't have any other lights. So then you can take those lights, and like I said, if you only show bits and pieces of your scene, you don't have to have all that detail. You can use it to create interesting other photos and so forth. So you can use this for more artistic purposes in that way. All right, well that's my demonstration. And I hope you enjoyed that. Questions? Any other questions? Yeah.
So I know the add-on is called Mass Modeling Importer, but would this work with RenderDoc captures from other processes other than rendering Google Maps?
In theory, yeah, but I haven't tried it. So,
okay.
Yeah, so if you're using the USGS sites or anything that is rendering in 3D, it just captures from the buffer, export it out. So in theory, yeah, it should work. I haven't tried it quite yet.
So it's doing it at the like the GL layer more.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So there's probably other data that you could probably get that would even be more detailed, but you're kind of just interpolating it from the GL data.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yep.
Yeah, the USGS data is point cloud LiDAR data.
Cool. All right, well, thank you all for coming. If you got any questions afterward, I'll be around. But enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.